Well, good afternoon and welcome to our latest discussion around DORA. This is Countdown to DORA, the lull before the storm. Now, as we know, there's an increasing amount of information flying around about DORA and what it means to various companies. And what we're trying to do today is explain a little bit around some of the legal aspects of what DORA means to you and really how it compares to previous legislation such as GDPR, and rather sadly, it's a lot more onerous, as you will find out. And then some of the more practical solutions. You know, where do we start? How do we get this program going? Are we affected by the program? What does it mean to us operationally? How on earth do we go about proving the fact that we are able to monitor even just our suppliers, which is an increasingly important part of DORA. And then we'll wrap up with some questions. If we've already had some questions in about the program. But before I hand over to Nick, please feel free. There is an ability to ask questions online if you look at your screen. Nick will be covering, say, the legal aspects. Antony will cover really some of the more operational pieces of the program, and Matt will be very brave and run a live presentation to show you what you can find out about your supply chain from your desktop, and then really what you can use that information for as part of your legislation program. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Nick Gibbons, who is the legal director at Clyde & Co. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So my name's Nick Gibbons. I'm legal director at Clyde & Co. I've been doing TMT and information security for a very long time. I'm going to look today really at the differences between DORA and what's already happening and explain why it's such a big sea change. So DORA is part of a suite of new EU legislation, which includes the EU AI directive and reforms to the Network and Information Security Directive. And the object of the exercise is generally to increase resilience and to deal basically with the number of ransomware attacks that there have been, partly as a result of COVID and partly just because it's become day-to-day business for all sorts of hackers. These various pieces of legislation are going to affect everybody in Europe and the UK, including insurers and their insureds. And unlike GDPR, which just covers personal data, is going to cover all sorts of data. The legislation is much more comprehensive and tougher than the earlier legislation, and it's going to cover businesses and their ICT service providers. So the background to DORA itself is basically as a result of the interconnectivity of the financial sector and the number of ransomware attacks, the EU decided they needed to address the resilience of the financial sector, including insurers, and to harmonise what had been a mishmash of national regulations within the EU. So they've created this framework of principles to mitigate the ICT risks and get everybody to adhere to common resiliency standards. The main provisions, and those that follow will be dealing with this in much more detail, but basically it's each institution and business that's covered's got to look at what their attack surface is. That means basically where the hackers can get in. So that means looking at their systems and everybody they connect with, including their service providers, and estimate what's going to happen if there is an attack and what they're going to do about it. There's two levels of risk reporting. There's voluntary risk reporting if it's not too serious, and mandatory risk reporting if it is very serious. There's resiliency testing, including penetration testing, information and intelligence sharing, managing ICT third-party risk, and it's going to be supervised by the various European supervisory authorities that deal with financial services. I think probably the biggest change in terms of who's going to be covered is the ICT third-party service providers, but others will deal with that in more detail later. So in terms of footprint, DORA itself applies to 21,000 EU financial institutions of all sorts, including insurers and many of the insurers' policyholders, and financial institutions outside the EU that have business within the EU or operations within the EU must also comply. So that means that the vast majority of UK insurers and their financial services policyholders are going to need to comply with this legislation. Now, as I said, coming down the track at much the same time is the EU AI directive and changes to the Network and Information Security Directive, which will apply similar provisions to every other sort of business. So this rigor is going to be more or less universal. In terms of sanctions under DORA, it's much more intrusive than earlier legislation, including GDPR. So financial institutions and their ICT suppliers are going to have to perform resiliency testing. There are going to be audits. And I think importantly, whereas people have got used to under GDPR only having to report what's happened once they've had an attack, there will be audits of both the ICT service suppliers and the financial services businesses without there having to have been an attack. And non-compliance will carry significant penalties. And my sense is that these penalties are going to be much more rigorously and regularly enforced than those that we've been used to under GDPR, which I think most people think of as the piece of information security legislation. The other thing is, I think that these DORA and whatever the PRA and the FCA are doing, which is going to come, which is similar but not so rigorous, are likely to become a benchmark for the courts. So when businesses are sued by affected entities, these provisions will be taken account of by the courts when they're deciding whether or not to award damages. So in terms of the differences between GDPR, the DPA, the NARS, the FCA and DORA, I think it's worth just looking at those differences just to demonstrate that this is a big sea change. And although the EU is saying that it's complementary and the other provisions are going to continue, the rigor and detail is going to be much greater. So GDPR Article 32 is what everybody looks at in terms of personal data. And so, I mean, the thing about GDPR is that it's quite general. It leaves it pretty much up to each individual data controller to decide what's appropriate. And if there's an incident, then that comes under the microscope by both those making a claim and by the ICO. I think the difference with DORA is that it's going to be much more technically prescriptive, and there's going to be auditing before anybody has an incident. So I've just listed here some key differences. This is really because I think a lot of people are so focused on personal data as the issue, whereas DORA and the other provisions, the other directives, are concerned with all sorts of data. So we're looking at commercial information, trade secrets, IP, confidential information, financial information, whether it's personal data or not. That is all coming within the auspices of DORA and the sister legislation. GDPR requires a data controller to enter into an agreement with the data processor. That's distinct from ICT service providers, which is, and they are one of the main focuses of DORA, as I've said. GDPR technical security guidance is quite unspecific. DORA is going to be much more detailed and specific. It's still in process. They're still deciding how it's going to work and what exactly those affected need to do, but it's going to be a lot more detailed and a lot more rigorous. As I said, GDPR only bites generally after an incident. DORA includes auditing provisions. GDPR fines, in my experience, aren't very frequently imposed, and I think DORA will be much more rigorously applied, and there'll be a lot more fining. FCA guidance before 2022 was pretty unspecific and unprescriptive. It's still there on their website. Since 2022, it was first published in 2017, there are provisions which are quite similar to DORA, but I don't think quite so. They won't be quite so prescriptive. There won't be so much auditing, I don't think, and there's not so much focus on third-party service providers. So, in my view, compliance with FCA, PRA, operational resilience provisions is probably not going to be enough to cut it with DORA. I think businesses have to focus on both and make sure they comply with both. Just a brief mention of Cyber Essentials and ISO 2701, because those are the things that pop up every time I deal with a cyber incident pursuant to GDPR. And DORA is going to be much more rigorous, obviously, than Cyber Essentials. And I think just getting ISO 2701 certification won't be enough, obviously. Just looking at Cyber Essentials, it's pretty basic. It was developed a few years ago. No focus on staff training, no real teeth. I think it's pretty outdated. I mean, it's good enough for, or has been good enough as something to say to the ICO when an SME gets hacked that they got Cyber Essentials certification, but it's nothing like enough to comply with DORA or the other legislation that is coming down the track. ISO 2701, not much reference to third-party service providers and no auditing. Obviously, certification is useful, but I don't think one can rely on that in any way, shape, or form when considering how to comply with what's coming down the track with DORA. So, similar legislation, the EU AI Act for artificial intelligence, that's another comprehensive set of rules which is coming down the track, which will affect all AI systems impacting people in the EU, and will also affect a lot of businesses in the UK, because as with DORA, they will be dealing with Europe. They will have operations in Europe or dealing with European customers. Network and Information Security Directive is to be reformed and replaced. And as with DORA, it's going to be clear and precise, cover all types of data, not just personal data. More entities and sectors will have to take measures to protect themselves. I mean, it's pretty comprehensive, and it will include medium-sized businesses. So I think, again, this is like DORA, this is going to be a sea change in terms of what businesses are expected to do in order to comply with the legislation. What impact is this going to have on insurers? Firstly, they've got to deal with these changes themselves internally, and probably more onerously, they're going to have to adjust their policies, their insurance policies, to address this greater rigor, simply because, as I said, in my view, these provisions are going to become the benchmark for the courts. And so it's going to be much tighter, and there's going to be much more opportunity for third parties to say that a particular policyholder hasn't complied with the legislation and therefore is liable in damages for whatever's happened during a cyber incident. So policy wordings will need to be reviewed to accommodate these changes, and that's not just standalone cyber policies. The fact is that there are lots of other policies which will cover DORA and its implications, and it will be another session of finding out what secret DORA is, in the same way as a lot of insurers have been looking at secret cyber. I think compliance is going to be expensive. A lot of financial services businesses are already dealing with the cost of complying with the new FCA and PRA rules. I think compliance with DORA is also going to be costly. And unlike the way things were a few years ago, board and management are going to have to be closely involved in all of this. So I'm now handing over to Antony.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning, everybody. I will just bring up my slides. So Nick has explained some of the legalities around DORA. What I'm going to cover in the next 15 minutes is very much more the what is DORA in a bit more detail, and how can you actually approach the journey that you need to be starting very quickly if you haven't already started that to comply. So I'm Antony Bream. I'm working with a company called Gibbons. Gibbons have a platform called DORA 360, which is being used to help organizations start to collect, analyze, report, and prove compliance to the regulators for the DORA journey. So just to give a little bit more flesh on the bone around the DORA regulation, it's enforced and has been enforced since January of the 16th of 2023. So it has actually been enforced for a year now. The next set of technical standards and the final set of technical standards will be delivered by June 2024. And the expectation there is that that will be the clarification of who are deemed to be the critical service providers that will need to also comply to DORA if they are a cloud service provider, a market data provider, or they're deemed to be providing a critical service to the FSIs across Europe. And then the final implementation is expected to be completed and demonstrable to the regulators by the 17th of January 2025. DORA consists of 5 pillars, 64 sections, 79 pages. I've read the Act quite a few times. And what really needs to be done here, and the main stakeholders involved in this are the Chief Risk Officer, the Chief Technology Officer, the Chief Information Security Officer, and sourcing, is first of all looking at the operational and the cyber policies. They need to be written, completed, amended, and made available across the whole of the business. So this is not just about cyber security. This is also about the daily operational processes that are followed across the business, as well as the cyber policies. So create processes for critical business services and map the resources that are relevant to each of those critical business services. And I'll be explaining in a few slides' time exactly how that can be done across the business. You also need to analyze data. So from the tools of risk management, cyber, third-party assessments, incident management, they all need to be collected together, and the data from those needs to be analyzed to spot patterns, trends, risks, areas of the business that are mostly at risk, whether it's an operational resilience risk, a cyber risk, a supplier risk. They all need to be assembled, consolidated, and analyzed, and that data needs to be shared with the regulator. But also the EBA are promoting that firms will also share data across themselves to help with a collective approach to how they're coping with DORA. You need to share incident reports with the regulator as they appear, similar to GDPR. You have 48 hours in which to take that information to the regulator to show where an incident has occurred. And you need to conduct internal audits and be prepared for regulator inspections on spot and announced. And tech suppliers, service providers, cloud providers will also need to perform their own internal attestations, testing on a regular annual basis. And insurance firms will also need to have exit plans and simulate those exit plans with key providers across their business on an annual basis as well, to show that they can actually offboard suppliers who are maybe not fitting within the DORA restrictions, and also onboard new suppliers quickly to replace them. So that annual exit planning needs to be assembled, tested, run through, and proven to the regulator that it's been completed. In terms of fines, well, Nick touched on this briefly. Penalty calculations will be similar to GDPR. So for an insurance company, it will be 4% of global revenue, plus they can also publicly list and shame firms that aren't meeting DORA compliance regulations. They can also ask and demand that service providers or FSIs that are in the scope of DORA, the 21,000 that Nick referred to, can pause or even terminate services if they're not complying with DORA. So a massive impact on the business if that is the case. And from an ICT provider perspective, the EBA estimates that 20,000 providers are in scope across the European Union and elsewhere. And out of that 20,000, 9,000 will be deemed to be critical. And if you are an ICT or a service provider which is deemed to be critical and you fail to comply to DORA, then the penalty will be 1% of the average worldwide turnover for that supplier. And that might be a cloud service provider, it could be a data, reference data, market data provider, it could be an outsourcing supplier as well. So fairly significant fines, reputational risk impacts, and also termination and pausing of services whilst firms are being investigated by the regulator. So if we look at the actual 5 pillars of DORA, there are 5 key pillars. Number 1 is ICT risk management, the ability to define, approve, oversee, and be accountable for the implementation of all arrangements related to ICT risk management frameworks. A number of firms have already probably worked on this with ITIL or something similar, but you now need to also oversee and be accountable for the implementation of that across the whole of the business. Number 2 is ICT-related incident management. This is the ability or the need to establish and implement an ICT-related incident management process so that you can actually detect, manage, and notify related incidents and have early warning indicators in place to alert before things go wrong. The 3rd pillar is digital operational resilience testing. And as Nick touched on, this is not just cyber, this is operational resilience across the whole of the insurance company. So testing programs that are considered to cover a wide variety of tests, limited not to IT systems, but also to process and people. One of the requirements of DORA also is that you are educating, informing, certifying, and proving to the regulator that you've actually informed the people who are impacted by a change in a policy change or process change, a supplier change. That education needs to be distributed across the organization, certified that people are performing the education, and prove that to the regulator as well. The 4th pillar is managing ICT third-party risk. This is an area that I'm seeing lots of firms really struggling with at the moment, inventorizing their third-party suppliers, putting in sufficient monitoring, surveillance of those suppliers as well. And as Nick referred to, there will be a fairly intensive piece of work where insurance firms will be going back out to their supply chain to renegotiate contracts to ensure that clauses are relevant and pertinent and protecting their business, because they are accountable and responsible for their supply chain as part of DORA. And this is managing the ICT third-party risk as an integral component of ICT risk within their ICT risk management framework. So you are responsible as the firm using that supply chain for the supply chain that you're using in terms of the DORA compliance. And then the 5th one is the information sharing arrangement, so exchanging amongst yourselves cyber threat information and intelligence, including indicators of compromise, tactics, techniques, and procedures to help you keep on top of the game there. And then this just gives a very quick overview of some of the key articles and the key principles of the various pillars that we talked about on the previous slide. And one of the key differences that DORA has with the FCA PRA approach is that DORA is far more outcome based. It's looking for outcomes and proof of outcomes rather than principles. So the PRA and the FCA are working on an operational resilience for third-party supply chain now, because they recognize that they have a gap in their equivalent compliance to DORA. That will probably be in effect in maybe 12 to 18 months' time. But these are all of the major articles that are relevant to firms like yourselves that you need to show compliance to across those 5 key pillars. So if we move more on to the how do we actually start the journey of compliance? Well, there are really sort of 5 key steps here. The first step is, number 1, defining all of your critical services, the functions which have a material impact on financial performance of the entity, of your firm. Going into each of those business areas and defining what's deemed to be critical as a critical function, critical business service, critical process. Second thing is to map those processes for all of those defined critical business services, defining the documented process flow, showing step by step how you manage that process that's deemed to be critical, with clear ICT role, assets, responsibilities, and accountabilities defined on those process maps. The third step is to map dependent resources, so the tools, the protocols required for the ICT asset to ensure that the protection of the same, including your third-party supply chain, is under scope, under scrutiny, and can demonstrate that you have control, governance, and remediation for those dependent resources. The fourth step is then to link the risks, the controls, and the policies. So any associated risk and control, policy procedure, checklist that is in scope for a critical business service has to be defined, and complete visibility has to be given to the whole of the organization of those. And number 5 is to run impact analysis and scenario testing. So help the management to know the impact of any change across the entity. So if there's a policy change, procedure change, a supplier change, that needs to be informed both to the internal audit teams, the regulator, your employee staff. Firms need to also demonstrate that they are educating and certifying the people impacted by that change as part of the DORA Act. And across all of those 5 critical steps, external data sources, data from third-party risks, and as Nick said, not just personal data, all relevant data from third-party risk management systems need to be considered, including cybersecurity systems, to show that you have control and oversight and surveillance of your supply chain. So how does this actually work? Well, GM, who I'm advising and working with on the DORA program, use a business process map. You can see here a diagram that shows the example of one, where you can very quickly and very easily and very simply define that critical business service. And you can see along the process map here, there's various boxes that are showing various activities. And at the bottom, you can see a number of activities that have CBS and manager, and they are defining the system that's being used, in this case, CBS, the role or the function responsible for that activity in a very simple and easy to understand way. And each of the icons that you can see here, whether it's a paperclip, a form, a person sitting at a desk, they represent either where a policy or a procedure or a risk or a control or a supplier is involved in that particular activity on the process. So you can very quickly and easily launch the relevant policy document, procedural document from that activity box, look into the status of the control or the risk, look at the supplier contract details at each step in the process to demonstrate that you have oversight, control, visibility, you're monitoring, but also you can check for changes, the impact of a change on a supplier, the impact of change on a policy. And you can also run a report to say, show me all of the relevant policies, procedures, processes, people, systems, suppliers that are linked into the article framework for DORA. So if I change a system, where will that impact my DORA compliance? What are the areas of DORA that I need to be concerned about? And the business area is also impacted by that change in the system. So you can do analysis across the whole of your business process services. But outside of that, there's also lots of tools that can be also brought in to make this easier, quicker, faster, and less of a burden. So a policy repository to allow you to link policies and procedures to the critical business services. So you're bringing everything into one single pane of glass. You're showing the regulator that you have control of all of the assets that are necessary to comply to DORA. Showing the DORA regulations from a user interface will allow people to see exactly the impact of a change on DORA across your business. Nick referred to existing standards, protocols, ISO 27001, ITIL frameworks. How does that link into my DORA compliance? So having an article-to-article linkage to show the ability to see whereabouts in DORA your ISO 27001 policies can be an impact, a way of proving your compliance. So linking all of those together to show where those linkages take effect. Managing your third-party risk from critical processes, categorizing and scanning your suppliers in real time frequently across a number of different factors. Managing your incidents and using AI to actually compare existing documents with regulatory clauses to generate gap analysis to show where you have gaps in your existing processes, policies and procedures, and where you need to fill those gaps to comply with DORA can be automated using an AI tool. And one of the areas that Nick also touched on is the need to allow the board to have complete control of their business in terms of DORA compliance. So this dashboard is an example of a single pane of glass showing your resilience, maturity over time, showing all of the various acts and articles and procedures and policies that are in scope to be changed, to be modified, to be remediated, or to be created to allow you to complete your DORA compliance and maintain it and show the regulator you have control of it. So all of these elements on this dashboard are showing the clause of article in DORA that's relevant, the assessment rating for its maturity level, and the actions that are in process to allow you to show the regulator where you've found an incident and how that's being remediated or controlled, where you're monitoring a policy that you may be changing, where you have a risk associated with a supplier, so you can show the regulator that you have complete oversight control, and you can zone into the bits of the business that have immediate causes for concern, and also connecting the board level with the doers on the ground so that the people following the policies, the procedures, the processes, you can get a very, very quick overview of exactly whereabouts in our business do we have issues that we need to be concerned about, we need to be acting upon, we need to be showing information to the regulator for, and we need to be reporting against. So all of this shows the continual supply of information that's being necessary for the articles of DORA and seeing exactly where you fit on your assessment ratings to show where you have gaps or weaknesses in your compliance to the various articles that DORA expect to see. And then finally, we've touched a little bit about vendor risk management, but allowing you to have this oversight, this ongoing monitoring and surveillance of your supply chain. And what you can see here is a complete solution that allows you to see across the organizational, financial, operational resilience, cyber, social media, real-time controversy alerting, compliance to regulatory needs, such as the FCA register, using that as a source of data, proactive vulnerability testing, and individual data analysis, covering sources of data such as Companies House, the Financial Ombudsman Service. We've talked about the FCA register, LinkedIn, lots and lots of data points, over 5 billion data points being collected to allow you to inventorize your critical suppliers, monitor them, and see exactly where you maybe need to do an investigation or act upon an issue that's been found across your supply chain so that you can be one step ahead of the regulation for DORA and you're not being fined because your supplier has put a vulnerability into your business operations and ability to operate them successfully. So this is really giving you that complete oversight of your supply chain. So that's hopefully giving you some background to DORA in terms of the Act, some of the tips, tools and techniques we're seeing working very well to help people comply. And I'll now hand over to Matthew, who will go into a bit more detail around the cyber side of the DORA compliance as well. So over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Antony. Let me share my screen. Okay, can we see everybody see okay?
All is good, yes.
Thank you, AJ. So I'm Matt Pearson. I work for a company called Panaraise, and we are a third-party cyber risk management platform. And what do? We provide a platform that manages the risk associated with sharing data with third parties. So a lot of people today have spoken about the need for a third-party management tool. within DORA, Panaraise is a specific tool to manage that third-party risk. Why third-party risk now? Well, unbelievably, the amount of third parties that an average company shares data with is about 583. This is from an independent source and a real number. And I know that sounds pretty unrealistic, but it is actually the amount of data, third parties we do share data with. And I'll show you how we can find all those third parties a bit later. And 54% of organizations breach through third parties in 2022. So there is a big risk out there of being breached through that third party organization. We're talking about DORA today, but obviously there's other regulations out there that require a audit around third-party risk management, how you manage it. And DORA is the key one today, but there are others out there. And what it can also do is save costs for an organization from a human and a capital expenditure. So having a tool like a Panaraise can really cut down the need for the amount of people that are running those third-party assessments and save costs for the organization. I'm going to show you a little bit about some of the risks that are involved with third parties, but there are a number of different ways that you could be breached via a third party. So third party availability is your service working? Has something happened that has stopped you having availability within that third party? Has there been a data leak, which we've seen lots of those happen over the last couple of years? Is there a vulnerability, like Antony mentioned previously in his slides? Is there a vulnerability within the third party that's going to affect you as an organization? And a third party cyber attack. Has somebody had a ransomware? Has somebody been hacked? And in turn, you're going to be hacked. So the top cyber attacks of 2023, there's 15 of them here. I won't ask anybody to guess, but you're going to be, it's unbelievable how many of those came from a third party attack. So you can see here, 12 out of the 15 had some sort of third-party component within the attack, and it's absolutely key that you get on top of the risk that is associated with third parties. How are teams doing at the moment? Lots of companies have tools. The majority of companies are trying to do this on a spreadsheet. Trying to manage 584 vendors on one spreadsheet and managing the whole process, the assessment, is almost impossible. Trying to audit the way that you're doing it on a spreadsheet is absolutely impossible. And actually keeping a continuous monitoring stand on those vendors via a spreadsheet is impossible. So I'm going to show you today a little bit how Panaraise can help you through that process. If you are still managing things on a spreadsheet or Excel, or you maybe have a basic tool. So the way that Panaraise works is we have a 4-step process. First thing we do is prioritization. We find out how many vendors you have within your organization. I'll show you in the demo in a minute how that works. We classify them. Are they critical, semi-critical, not so critical? What the business impact of those vendors are. So what do they look like to you as a vendor? And then we put them in an inventory in the platform. Once we've done that and we've classified them, then we can start evaluating some of those vendors, some of the critical ones and the semi-critical ones. And we do that in a 2-step process. We send out what we call a SMART questionnaire, which is unique to each of the vendors based on their business impact to us as a company. And then we do a cyber assessment, which is a cyber scan of publicly available information. And then we correlate both of those bits of information and come up with a score and a remediation plan or next step mitigation that says, we've done a scan, we've done a questionnaire, here are the things we think you need to fix before we can approve you as a vendor, and we can work with you safely in the knowledge that you're not going to get breached and we're not going to get breached. And that's great. And if you're on a spreadsheet, you may tick a box and say they've been approved, they've been assessed. Forget about it until next year when we assess them again. But what Panaraise does to mitigate that is we do what we call continuous monitoring. So every 3 days, we're doing the cyber scan that we did in the evaluation stage to monitor and understand whether anything has happened or anything has changed within that vendor since you've approved them. You could approve them one day, next day they get breached, and you get breached. So we're monitoring them all the time, doing this continuous monitoring, offering you a risk insight and a way of responding to those risks that we find on a continual basis. Really, absolutely key with the third party cyber risk. So today we've been talking about DORA, and these 6 pillars are really what is affected by DORA and the third party ICT risk. And how can Panarrays help you with these 6 components? If we look at how Panarrays helps, a strategy for managing third party ICT risk, a register of information, and incident reporting. A strategy is exactly what I've just shown you on the last slide, a 4-step process of onboarding, assessing, and continually monitoring those vendors. A register is exactly that, what we talked about with the inventory, putting the third parties into an inventory, understanding what third parties you have. There'll be lots out there you don't know about, a lot of shadow IT going on. And then incident reporting is the continuous monitoring piece, understanding exactly what the risks are from those third parties. And if there is an incident, how do we report it and how do we audit it? This statement is part of DORA, monitoring the entire ICT subcontracting chain by the financial entity. The financial entity must fully monitor the ICT subcontracting chain and must document it. It's almost impossible to do it unless you're using a platform like Panarrays. Panarrays is a reasonably small startup company, but we have some big customers, a lot of customers using us to get through some regulatory requirements, and more of these customers are coming to us and asking us about DORA. How can we help them with DORA? How can we get them through the process? How can we complete their third-party management piece of DORA? Lots of insurance companies, lots of financials, people that have regulations they have to meet, and a lot of those are referenceable as well if you need to see them. AJ asked me to put in an average customer sort of landscape. So an average customer size is have 25 critical vendors, 25 semi-critical vendors, and 25 non-critical vendors. That's quite a sort of medium-sized insurance company, financial company. And the good thing about Panarrays is included in the price of that. So the way we charge it is a 800, 400, 200 per vendor per year. It's a SaaS product held in GCP in Belgium, so it meets all the EU regulations, UK regulations. But the great thing about Panarrays is that we include all the onboarding and customer success process within the price of the software license. So I just wanted to give you an understanding of how much it might cost in case you thought it was going to cost you millions to get this program in place. It's actually quite affordable. As AJ said, I'm going to be very brave and try and do a live demo. So bear with me. I'm just going to go into my live demo. And please let me know if you can see my live demo. Yes, no.
Yeah, looking good.
Okay, thanks AJ, thank you. So this is the Panarrays platform, and as we were talking about earlier, you need to have a register of all of your suppliers that you're trying to onboard and where they are in the process. If we go into this slide here, into this section of the tool here, you can see all of the suppliers that you have, third-party suppliers that you have within your inventory. Now, most people are adding these suppliers on their own and then doing an assessment on them. What Panarrays has come up with is a real cool bit of the tool where we do what we call supply chain discovery. So we could click on a button and we'll go out and find out what third-party vendors you have within your ecosystem. It really helps with some of that shadow IT that I talked about earlier, and it's a really neat component that we've just brought into the tool and is helping with actually finding out and getting an inventory of your real suppliers. If I go, once you've done that, and got all of your suppliers into the platform, then we can do an assessment on each one of those suppliers. If I click on one of these suppliers, which is just a dummy supplier, this is what an assessment would look like for one of those suppliers. So you've got a cyber posture rating, that's the scan I was talking about earlier. You've got a questionnaire rating, the smart questionnaire that we build for each one of those vendors individually. And then we combine those two scores and we do what we call a correlated insight and say, if there's something within the questionnaire that doesn't meet what we found within the scan, we're going to ask the vendor to explain that. And we come up with a combined score and we look at the business impact of that vendor. So what does that mean? A business impact is basically a minimal business impact vendor for you might be somebody that supplies you coffee or a cleaning company. You still want to do a risk assessment because they're going to have people wandering around your office and you want to understand whether they're doing background checks. A severe business impact is going to be somebody that you're sharing your SaaS data with, your PII data with, some intellectual property. So we want to understand that. And by doing that, we can then give them a risk rating. And how we do that is by looking at the findings from the cyber scan. These are some of the findings from the cyber scan. We look at the questionnaires. We can see which questionnaires they've answered. You can literally go into each one of those questionnaires and see what the answers are. And then once we've done all that, we can come up with a remediation plan, which is the mitigation, which says, Mr. Third Party, we found these things. We think there's vulnerabilities. We think there's things you need to fix before we can approve you. And here's the remediation plan for that. And please go ahead and work on those tasks so we can approve you as a vendor. Once they are approved and in the system, one of the things we talked about earlier on was monitoring and understanding if there has been an incident. Part of this tool is called the Risk Insights and Response Portal. Every one of those vendors is being scanned all the time. And if we find anything within any of those vendors, it will come into this Risk Insights Response Portal, and you can see that 0-day attack, one of your suppliers has been affected. If we go down a bit further, one of the suppliers has been affected. There'll be a big one in there somewhere where lots of your suppliers, 3 of your suppliers have been affected. If we click on this one, you can see which of your direct suppliers have been affected by this known vulnerability, Thermo Fisher American Airlines. And the easiest thing about this system is a button on the top right-hand side, you've got send questionnaire. You literally send each one of those vendors a questionnaire and say, we know you've been affected by this vulnerability. Can you tell us how you're going to mitigate it? And send back a report to us via this questionnaire process. But the other really cool thing about this is, if I go down a bit further, because it doesn't happen very often, we're monitoring your environment as well. So if a red badge comes up, hold on one second. There we go. If a red badge comes up and we found a vulnerability within some of the third parties we're dealing with, we also found it in your organization. Your company's been directly impacted by this insight. You can go and look at which direct suppliers have. So 41 indirect suppliers you can't do too much about at the moment. We're working on a roadmap for how you can work with fourth party, fifth party, end party parties. So there's a way of reporting and understanding incidents. There's a way, a register of your suppliers, and there's an assessment of those suppliers. So you know you're not going to get breached if they get breached, and you can understand that process and understand what their security posture is based on this platform alone. I think that's it from me, AJ. I'm just going to put this slide up, and it gives us hopefully 5 minutes to have some questions.
Some Q&A, yes. Well, thanks ever so much, and say thank you to all the presenters. Like I say, it's never great news when you have to adhere to all these compliance issues, but yeah, that is it's not going to get any easier, I think it's fair to say. So yes, before I open the floor up, but we've had a few questions in. Number one is, can we share the slide deck? And the answer is yes, we'll make that available. That'll be sometime early next week, and we'll make sure that's available for those that wish. But question-wise, one question is, how do you recommend firms approach the gap analysis to see which areas need working on, bearing in mind the limited time left to comply? That's a fairly open question and quite difficult to answer in one fell swoop, but does anyone want to have a answer?
Yeah,
That's probably one of yours.
Yeah, yeah, I can take that question. So it's a really pertinent and current question. Lots of firms are now looking at this gap analysis space. So first of all, on my slides, I refer to, identifying, number one, the critical business services. So what are deemed to be critical? The EBA, the regulator, has defined those criticalities. Their most recent consultation paper output in January was to do with incident categorization, so how you categorize incidents. But at the higher level of that, identifying your critical business services will then feed into your critical business processes, will feed into your critical business providers and suppliers. So if you refer back to my slides, I showed you the sort of process style of taking that information in. Building up those processes is very quick, simple, effective to analyze the gaps, to analyze compliance. The DORA 360 platform that we refer to has all of the DORA articles embedded into it, so you can then very quickly associate the service, the process, the policy, the procedure, the person, the supplier to the various articles and acts that are relevant across DORA. And by doing that process mapping, you're not just doing it once for DORA, you can then overlay any standard framework regulation on top of that. So you can also then say this also is impacted by 27001. This is also part of our ITIL framework. This also refers to the FCA PRA Operational Resilience Act. So you're overlaying all of the various compliance points that you need to show across multiple regulators, not just for DORA. And also those processes can be also reused for BAU. So if you're doing a supplier removal, you're doing an outsourced provision, you're looking at data controls across your business, those same process maps can be reused for multiple BAU activities, scenario planning, as well as assessments and reports to show the regulator how you would onboard a supplier and offboard an existing one. So really taking that simplistic approach, but overlaying the intelligence on top of that process map is a good way to start.
Thank you. Question around supply chain monitoring. I imagine this will be relevant to a few people because quite often organizations do not have resources available freely. But can this be run as a managed service to manage your suppliers and the supply chain? I guess using Panarrays, and I know that Northdoor are working with you, Matt, to offer that as a service, but that's perfectly feasible, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the tool is multi-tenant inherently, and yes, we offer it as a managed service, and lots of customers are going down that road because they don't have the resources to manage the process. So yeah, and Northdoor would be our choice of MSSP to work with.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. One for Nick. You touched briefly, Nick, about comparing DORA to GDPR. I know that obviously GDPR is more personal data led and DORA is more operational. But how much additional complexity do you think there will be for organisations, bearing in mind the depth of the regulation for DORA?
I think there'll be an enormous amount more complexity because DORA. Firstly, there's the point about the service providers, which GDPR doesn't really deal with. It deals with processors, not service providers. But I think the other main point is that there's a lot of focus in DORA on specific technical detail, and there's also the point about auditing. I mean, what one finds with a lot of hacking incidents under GDPR is that although the organization may have got all the certification, they've done all the work, they've done everything, they've got, they've done, it completely comprehensive, but someone's forgot to patch the system, and then a hacker gets in, and that's a life threat to the business. Now with DORA, there is going to be constant the constant threat of auditing hanging over the business. So so that people are going to have to work hard to keep everything up to date, and they can be fined not just as a result of an incident, but because they haven't kept things up to date, they haven't complied. So there's no need for an incident for people to get caught out. So I think there's a huge difference in terms of specificity auditing third-party suppliers. I think it's a completely different world, and I think it's going to require a lot more work and a lot more focus.
Very good, thank you. And on that cheerful note, I would like to thank all the speakers today for sharing their solutions, and to Brian, as always, for organising another great event. As before, we'll ensure that the presentation is available for you all. Should you have any questions, our contact details will be on the presentation, but in the interim, you could always contact Brian if you have any questions, and he can pass them on to the relevant party. But thank you again. Thank you for attending. I hope you found it useful. It is a complex environment we find ourselves in, but sadly, it's not going away. So we'll be running a series of these events throughout the year to try and provide some guidance and assistance to those that find themselves in at the coalface of DORA legislation. But please enjoy your afternoons, enjoy your weekends, and it seems to have stopped raining. So make the most of it and have a good weekend. Thanks ever so much.